July 24, 1943, 120 miles west of Truck Lagoon. The ocean was still and heavy. The kind of silence that makes a man's heartbeat sound louder than the waves. Inside the dim steel belly of an American submarine, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit leaned into the eyepiece of his periscope. Through the fogged lens, he saw something every submarine commander dreamed of: a massive Japanese tanker dead in the water. Its engines were crippled, its crew in panic. 20,000 tons of steel just waiting to be sunk. Daspit had already hit it twice. 2 perfect strikes. But now came the final shot. The kill that would seal the mission. He lined up his crosshairs with the tanker's midsection, the geometry of destruction perfect at a 90-degree angle. He gave the order. The torpedo fired. Seconds later, quit a thud, but no explosion. The crew stared in disbelief. The torpedo had hit its target and simply bounced off. What Daspit didn't know yet was that this silent failure wasn't just a fluke. It was proof of the greatest weapons scandal in American history. For 18 long months, the U.S. Navy had been fighting the Pacific War with torpedoes that barely worked. Out of every 10 fired, only 2 exploded properly. Submariners were dying, not because they lacked courage, but because their weapons betrayed them. Japanese ships that should have been at the bottom of the ocean sailed home untouched. And the worst part? The Navy's own engineers kept insisting the problem didn't exist. But one man, a stubborn, sharp and furious admiral named Charles Lockwood, would risk his career, his honor, and maybe even court-martial to uncover the truth. It had all started the day after Pearl Harbor. The world had changed overnight. The Pacific turned into a battlefield, and the United States unleashed its submarines on Japanese shipping. Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered unrestricted warfare. Everything that floated and carried the rising sun was fair game. U.S. believed it had the deadliest underwater weapon ever built. The Mark 14 torpedo. 20 feet long, sleek and heavy with explosives, it was the pride of American engineering. It could travel almost 9,000 yards, cost as much as 15 cars, and was said to be unstoppable. Its secret weapon was the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, a device so advanced it didn't even have to hit a ship. It could sense the magnetic field of a vessel and detonate underneath it, snapping a ship's spine in half. At least that was the theory. The Navy had tested it exactly twice, back in 1926. The first test was a failure. The second one destroyed a retired submarine, and the Navy called that proof of perfection. For 17 years, not a single live test was done again. Torpedoes were too expensive to waste, and the Depression had already drained military budgets. So the Navy tested only in calm tanks and with fake warheads. On paper, the torpedoes were flawless. But war doesn't happen on paper. December 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Commander Tyrell Jacobs of the submarine USS Sargo launched 8 torpedoes at 2 Japanese ships. 8 perfect shots, 8 failures. Not one explosion. He was sure his math was right, sure his angles were right, but nothing worked. Across the Pacific, reports started piling up. Commanders wrote the same words again and again. Torpedoes running too deep. Premature explosions, no. Detonation on impact, some. Torpedoes even turned back toward their own submarines. Deadly circles that made every firing a gamble with death. By mid-1942, U.S. submarines had fired over 800 torpedoes, and nearly 80% had failed. The Pacific should have been filled with burning ships. Instead, the enemy kept sailing as if America's submarines were firing blanks. The commanders demanded answers. They begged for testing, for investigation, but Washington had already decided where to point the blame. "The torpedoes are fine," said the Bureau of Ordnance. "It's the men who are the problem." They said the submariners were careless, bad at calculations, or maintaining weapons incorrectly. But men like Daspit and Jacobs knew the truth. They weren't missing. The torpedoes were lying. In Pearl Harbor, one admiral refused to look away. His name was Charles Andrews Lockwood, a man born for submarines. He had been commanding them since 1914, back when the ocean still feared these steel beasts. He knew how they sounded, how they moved, and more importantly, how the men inside them thought. When veteran commanders began sending the same desperate reports, Lockwood believed them. By 1942, he was in charge of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Southwest Pacific, and what he saw horrified him. Ships were escaping, missions were failing, and brave men were dying because of a machine that wouldn't do its job. And so, without permission, Lockwood decided to do something the Navy had forbidden. He would test the torpedoes himself. July 24, 1943, 120 miles west of Truk Lagoon. The ocean was still and heavy, the kind of silence that makes a man's heartbeat sound louder than the waves. Inside the dim steel belly of an American submarine, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit leaned into the eyepiece of his periscope. Through the fogged lens, he saw something every submarine commander dreamed of: a massive Japanese tanker dead in the water. Its engines were crippled, its crew in panic. 20,000 tons of steel just waiting to be sunk. Daspit had already hit it twice. 2 perfect strikes. But now came the final shot. The kill that would seal the mission. He lined up his crosshairs with the tanker's midsection, the geometry of destruction perfect at a 90-degree angle. He gave the order. The torpedo fired. Seconds later, quit a thud, but no explosion. The crew stared in disbelief. The torpedo had hit its target, and simply bounced off. What Daspit didn't know yet was that this silent failure wasn't just a fluke. It was proof of the greatest weapons scandal in American history. For 18 long months, the U.S. Navy had been fighting the Pacific War with torpedoes that barely worked. Out of every 10 fired, only 2 exploded properly. Submariners were dying, not because they lacked courage, but because their weapons betrayed them. Japanese ships that should have been at the bottom of the ocean sailed home untouched. And the worst part? The Navy's own engineers kept insisting the problem didn't exist. But one man, a stubborn, sharp and furious admiral named Charles Lockwood, would risk his career, his honor, and maybe even court-martial to uncover the truth. It had all started the day after Pearl Harbor. The world had changed overnight. The Pacific turned into a battlefield, and the United States unleashed its submarines on Japanese shipping. Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered unrestricted warfare. Everything that floated and carried the rising sun was fair game. U.S. believed it had the deadliest underwater weapon ever built. The Mark 14 torpedo. 20 feet long, sleek and heavy with explosives, it was the pride of American engineering. It could travel almost 9,000 yards, cost as much as 15 cars, and was said to be unstoppable. Its secret weapon was the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, a device so advanced it didn't even have to hit a ship. It could sense the magnetic field of a vessel and detonate underneath it, snapping a ship's spine in half. At least that was the theory. The Navy had tested it exactly twice, back in 1926. The first test was a failure. The second one destroyed a retired submarine, and the Navy called that proof of perfection. For 17 years, not a single live test was done again. Torpedoes were too expensive to waste, and the Depression had already drained military budgets. So the Navy tested only in calm tanks and with fake warheads. On paper, the torpedoes were flawless. But war doesn't happen on paper. December 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Commander Tyrell Jacobs of the submarine USS Sargo launched 8 torpedoes at 2 Japanese ships. 8 perfect shots, 8 failures. Not one explosion. He was sure his math was right, sure his angles were right, but nothing worked. Across the Pacific, reports started piling up. Commanders wrote the same words again and again. Torpedoes running too deep. Premature explosions. No. Detonation on impact. Some torpedoes even turned back toward their own submarines. Deadly circles that made every firing a gamble with death. By mid-1942, U.S. submarines had fired over 800 torpedoes, and nearly 80% had failed. The Pacific should have been filled with burning ships. Instead, the enemy kept sailing as if America's submarines were firing blanks. The commanders demanded answers. They begged for testing, for investigation, but Washington had already decided where to point the blame. "The torpedoes are fine," said the Bureau of Ordnance. "It's the men who are the problem." They said the submariners were careless, bad at calculations, or maintaining weapons incorrectly. But men like Daspit and Jacobs knew the truth. They weren't missing. The torpedoes were lying. In Pearl Harbor, one admiral refused to look away. His name was Charles Andrews Lockwood, a man born for submarines. He had been commanding them since 1914, back when the ocean still feared these steel beasts. He knew how they sounded, how they moved, and more importantly, how the men inside them thought. When veteran commanders began sending the same desperate reports, Lockwood believed them. By 1942, he was in charge of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Southwest Pacific, and what he saw horrified him. Ships were escaping, missions were failing, and brave men were dying because of a machine that wouldn't do its job. And so, without permission, Lockwood decided to do something the Navy had forbidden. He would test the torpedoes himself. During testing, the engineers had used lightweight practice warheads. But in real combat, the torpedoes carried heavy explosive warheads that made them sink deeper. Worse, the depth sensor, a pressure device, had been placed near the torpedo's tail, where water flow created low pressure, tricking the mechanism into diving even deeper. It was a flaw so obvious that one real test could have exposed it. But no one wanted to waste an expensive torpedo. The result? Hundreds of wasted lives instead. By late 1942, Lockwood's fleet adjusted. They began setting torpedoes to run at 0 feet, to compensate for the 11-foot error. Finally, the weapons seemed to hit at the right depth, but then came a new nightmare: premature explosions. Submariners watched through their periscopes as torpedoes exploded halfway to the target. The detonations bloomed in empty water, hundreds of yards too early. In April 1943, Lieutenant Commander John A. Scott of USS Tunney had a once-in-a-lifetime shot. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Hiyo, Chunyo, and Taiyo, lined up only 880 yards away. He fired 10 torpedoes. 7 explosions echoed through the sea. But none of the ships were hit, they just kept sailing. The torpedoes had exploded before reaching them. April 10, 1943, USS Pompano launched 6 torpedoes at another Japanese carrier. 3 blew up too early. June 10th, USS Trigger attacked Hiyo again. 1 missed, 1 exploded prematurely, 1 was a dud, and the rest barely scratched the target. For submarine crews, it was torture. They were stalking perfect targets, risking their lives, only to watch their weapons self-destruct. By mid-1943, everyone knew the truth. The magnetic exploder, the Navy's secret advantage, was a disaster. Lockwood begged to disable it, but the Bureau resisted. They proposed new rules: fire only under special conditions, increase arming distance from 450 to 700 yards, and avoid certain depths. Admiral King refused. He ordered all Pacific submarines to disable the magnetic exploder entirely. From that day, torpedoes would use only contact detonation, a direct hit. 18 months into the war, America finally admitted what the submariners already knew. Their wonder weapon was broken. But even that wasn't the end of it, because as soon as the magnetic feature was gone, another deadly problem surfaced: torpedoes that hit the enemy and didn't explode at all. For submarine crews, It was like a curse that wouldn't die. And for one man, Lawrence Daspit of the USS Tenosa, that curse was about to become history's breaking point. July 24, 1943, Pacific Ocean. The morning sun painted the waves in gold. But inside the USS Tenosa, the air was tense. Every man aboard could feel it. Something big was coming. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit stood at the periscope, his jaw tight, his eyes unblinking. There it was, the Tonan Maru No. 3, a Japanese tanker so huge it looked like a floating fortress. 19,000 tons of steel, unescorted, perfectly exposed. To a submarine commander, this was the dream target, the kind you get once in a lifetime. And after months of failures, after so many torpedoes had betrayed them, Daspit's crew was desperate for a win. At 9:28 a.m., he fired 4 torpedoes from a distance of 4,000 yards. Each one sliced through the water like a silver blade. 4 solid hits, only 2 explosions. The tanker's engine stopped. Black smoke rose from its deck. The ship was crippled but still afloat. Daspit's men cheered and they had it trapped. Now all they needed was one clean shot to finish it off. He maneuvered the Tenosa closer, 875 yards. Point-blank range. The geometry was perfect, 90 degrees. The ideal attack angle every submariner was trained for. "Fire tube 5, Daspit ordered. The torpedo raced forward, leaving a white streak across the water. It struck the tanker with a hollow thud. No explosion. Silence. Then disbelief. "What the hell?" one crewman muttered. "Maybe a bad hit," another said. Daspit stayed calm, at least on the surface. "Load the next one," he ordered. Torpedo 6 hit. No explosion. Torpedo 7 hit. Nothing. Torpedo 8 hit. Still nothing. By now the crew was staring in horror. 4 perfect shots, 4 failures. The tanker wasn't moving. It was practically begging to be sunk. And the Navy's best torpedoes were bouncing off like stones on a pond. Daspit called his torpedo officer to the control room. They checked everything. Depth settings, trigger arms, firing circuits. Every system showed green. There was no mechanical explanation. No human error. So Daspit did the only thing he could. He fired again. Torpedo 9, hit, no explosion. Torpedo 10. No explosion. Torpedo 11, nothing. He could barely believe what he was seeing. In his patrol log, Daspit later wrote, "This torpedo hit well aft on the port side, made a splash, then jumped out of the water like a porpoise. I find it hard to convince myself that I actually saw it." The men stared in silence. They weren't just fighting the Japanese anymore. They were fighting their own weapons. Before Daspit could fire again, a Japanese destroyer appeared on the horizon. The ocean that had felt like an empty battlefield moments ago now boiled with danger. Depth charges exploded around them. The Tenosa dove deep, the hull groaning under the pressure. When the destroyer finally gave up the chase, Daspit surfaced again. His ship had taken a beating, but his anger burned hotter than fear. 15 torpedoes fired. 11 direct hits. Only 2 explosions. That wasn't just a malfunction, it was madness. He had 1 torpedo left. Instead of wasting it, he made a decision that would change everything. He would take it home. 2 weeks later, the USS Tenosa limped back into Pearl Harbor. Word spread fast. Daspit had found the smoking gun. He walked straight into headquarters, carrying his patrol report like a weapon. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood was waiting for him. Lockwood later wrote, "I expected Daspit to explode, to curse me, the Bureau, the whole Navy. But he didn't. He just looked tired. And said, 'Admiral, the torpedoes don't work.' The torpedo he had brought back was examined from nose to tail. Technicians took it apart, tested every wire, every spring, every detonator. Nothing was wrong. Everything was in perfect working order. And yet, it hadn't exploded." Lockwood realized the Navy's nightmare wasn't over. The torpedo that was supposed to win the war was a weapon of chance. Sometimes it worked. Most times it didn't. The Bureau of Ordnance had ignored the depth issue, denied the magnetic failures. Now Lockwood knew they'd deny this too, unless he could prove it beyond any doubt. So he decided to do something bold, reckless and career-ending if it went wrong. He would launch his own secret investigation. No more excuses. No more reports. It was time to find out why America's deadliest weapon refused to kill. August 1943, Pearl Harbor. The Hawaiian air was heavy with heat and frustration. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood had heard enough excuses, enough denials. Now, he was going to see the truth with his own eyes. Inside his office, Lockwood leaned over a map of the Hawaiian Islands. Two names were circled, Maui and Kahoolawe, isolated, rocky, and perfect for testing. He turned to his torpedo and gunnery officer, Commander Art Taylor, and said quietly, "We're going to fire live warheads, and we're going to find out what's wrong." Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Breaking Navy protocol. The Bureau of Ordnance had forbidden such tests. Each torpedo cost a small fortune, and destroying one without permission was career suicide. But Lockwood didn't care anymore. His men were dying at sea while bureaucrats sat safely behind desks. This wasn't rebellion. This was justice. On August 31st, 1943, under a burning Pacific sun, the submarine USS Muskellunge slid through the waves off the coast of Kahoolawe Island. The cliffs there were steep and solid, the perfect natural wall to test explosions. The order came. Fire 1. A torpedo shot forward, slicing through the water, striking the rock face. Boom! A perfect explosion. Cheers erupted across the deck. Then came the second shot, and another hit, another explosion, but the third torpedo. Helmer, no explosion. The crew went silent. Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Mommsen, the legendary submariner known for rescuing men from the sunken USS Squalus, dove into the water himself to inspect the failed torpedo. He was a man who trusted evidence, not opinions, and what he saw under the surface confirmed his worst fears. The torpedo had split open, the warhead cracked, the mechanism crushed. It hadn't detonated, not because of bad aim, but because the impact had destroyed its own firing system. The harder the hit, the higher the chance of failure. The perfect 90-degree strike, the one every submariner was trained to take, was the most likely to fail. Mommsen personally oversaw the recovery of the dud. The crew hauled the broken torpedo back onto a barge and returned it to Pearl Harbor. There, with technicians standing by, Mommsen and Taylor carefully dismantled the exploder mechanism. Inside, they found the truth the Navy had refused to see. The firing pin, the heart of the weapon, had released correctly but jammed halfway. It had not traveled far enough to ignite the explosive cap. The force of the impact had bent the delicate metal rails, stopping it cold. The result? A direct hit, with no detonation. It was as if the torpedo punched the enemy and then fell silent. Lockwood listened as Mommsen explained the results. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with fury. "This isn't just a design flaw," he said. "This is negligence. The Mark VI exploder, designed decades earlier, was too fragile for the high-speed torpedoes now being used in war. The Bureau's engineers had ignored older lessons from World War I, that heavy impacts could jam the firing pin. And now, history was repeating itself, at the cost of countless American lives." But Lockwood didn't stop there. He ordered Taylor and Mommsen to run another test, one that would simulate impact under controlled conditions. They borrowed an old crane rig from the Pearl Harbor shipyard. They filled dummy torpedo heads with sand to match the weight of real warheads. Then one by one they dropped them from a height of 90 feet onto a steel plate angled to represent a ship's hull. Each drop recreated the same speed as a torpedo, traveling at 46 knots, the speed of the Mark 14. The results were shocking. When the sand filled, warheads hit the plate at a perfect 90-degree angle. Nearly 7 out of 10 failed to trigger. When dropped at 45 degrees, the failure rate was half that. The data was clear. The U.S. Navy had been training its submarine crews to aim for the worst possible angle. The perfect shot was the deadliest trap. Lockwood stared at the test results, his jaw clenched. He knew what he had to do, something that would shake the Navy to its core. He drafted a fleet-wide message to every submarine commander in the Pacific. Do not fire at 90-degree angles. Fire at oblique angles, 45 degrees or less. The order confused and angered many officers. For years they had been taught that a 90-degree strike was the ideal hit. Now their admiral was telling them the opposite. But Lockwood didn't care about tradition anymore. He cared about survival. Soon reports began coming in. The number of dewed torpedoes dropped dramatically. Submarines started scoring real kills again. For the first time in months, the ocean echoed with the sounds of true explosions. But Lockwood wasn't finished. He knew this wasn't a permanent solution. It was just a temporary fix. The torpedoes still needed a complete redesign. The Bureau of Ordnance wouldn't help. They refused to admit another mistake. So Lockwood took matters into his own hands again. He ordered his engineers aboard the submarine tender USS Holland to start manufacturing new firing pin, ones that wouldn't jam. Lieutenant E.A. Johnson, a young, brilliant officer, designed a lighter, stronger firing block made from aluminum alloy instead of steel. And the source of that aluminum? Propellers taken from Japanese aircraft that had crashed during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same metal once used to destroy American ships was now being melted down to fix America's broken torpedoes. Late 1943, Pearl Harbor. The sun dipped low behind the mountains as Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood sat alone in his office, staring at a pile of reports stacked on his desk. Every page told the same story: lives lost, missions failed, and ships that should have been sunk still sailing free. For nearly 2 years, America's submariners had been sent into combat with faulty weapons, and the men who built those weapons had the audacity to blame the crews who fired them. Lockwood's patience was gone. He was done writing polite letters. He was done waiting for permission. From now on, he was taking the fight directly to the people who caused it. He called in his engineering team, Commander Art Taylor, Lieutenant E.A. Johnson, and the legendary Swede Mommsen. "Gentlemen," Lockwood said, his voice low but firm, "we're going to fix these torpedoes ourselves, with or without Washington's blessing." The room fell silent. Every man knew the risk. They were about to directly defy the Bureau of Ordnance, one of the most powerful arms of the U.S. Navy. But they also knew Lockwood was right. The Bureau's arrogance had killed too many good sailors. So, inside the workshops of USS Holland, the Pacific's great submarine tender, a quiet revolution began, day and night. The ship's crew worked under floodlights, machining new parts from scratch. Using aluminum salvaged from Japanese planes, Lieutenant Johnson reshaped the torpedoes. Delicate firing block not replacing the heavy steel piece that jammed on impact with a lightweight alloy that could move freely even under high force. Mommsen tested every prototype like a scientist and a soldier combined, meticulous, fearless, never satisfied until it was perfect. And when the first modified torpedo was ready, they called Lockwood to the dock. The weapon gleamed under the Hawaiian sun. It looked the same, but inside it was reborn. "Ready to test?" Lockwood asked. "Ready, sir," Taylor said. The torpedo was loaded into its tube aboard a submarine waiting offshore. The target, a cliff face off Kahoolawe, the same place where the duds had once humiliated them. Fire 1. The torpedo cut through the water, straight, steady, determined. Then, boom! A thunderous explosion ripped across the sea, echoing against the cliffs. Lockwood smiled for the first time in months. They fired another. Boom. And another. Boom! 3 torpedoes. 3 explosions. 0 failures. The deck erupted in cheers. After 2 years of lies, denials, and broken weapons, the truth was finally undeniable. The Mark 14 torpedo worked, but not because of the Bureau. Not because of government testing. It worked because a handful of men had refused to stay silent. Lockwood wasted no time. He immediately ordered every submarine under his command to replace the old steel firing blocks with Johnson's new aluminum design. Within weeks, the Pacific began to change. Suddenly, Japanese cargo ships started disappearing. Tankers, destroyers, even warships were vanishing beneath the waves. The ocean, once filled with American frustration, now roared with vengeance. Submarine commanders who had once doubted their own skills were now legends. The results were so dramatic that even the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer hide. In Washington, the Bureau's officials were furious, not because they were wrong, but because Lockwood had proven them wrong without permission. They summoned him to explain his actions. Lockwood walked into the meeting room wearing his dress uniform, shoulders straight, expression calm. Across the table sat the men who had dismissed every complaint, blamed every commander, and nearly lost the war through arrogance. One official leaned forward and said, "Admiral Lockwood, you had no authority to modify the Mark 14 design. You risked government property. You could have been court-martialed." Lockwood didn't blink. He placed his hands flat on the table and replied, "Gentlemen, if it were your sons inside those submarines, you'd have done the same damn thing." Silence filled the room, because deep down, they all knew he was right. By the end of 1943, the modified torpedoes were standard issue across the Pacific Fleet, and the results were immediate. Submarine patrols began reporting record-breaking sinkings. Convoy routes that had once been safe for Japan were now death traps. In less than a year, U.S. submarines, once dismissed as ineffective, sank over half of Japan's merchant fleet. The tables of the Pacific War had finally turned. But for Lockwood, it wasn't victory he felt, it was relief. He walked the docks at Pearl Harbor late one evening, the sunset bleeding into the waves. He could hear laughter again, sailors shouting, engines roaring, life returning to the fleet. He knew it had cost him friends, reputation, and sleepless nights. But he also knew something greater. The truth had finally prevailed. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood never sought glory. He didn't want medals or monuments. What he wanted and what he fought for was honesty, courage, and accountability. Because war isn't just about fighting the enemy. Sometimes the hardest battle is against your own system, against pride, bureaucracy, and blind faith in perfection. And thanks to one stubborn admiral, one courageous crew, and one impossible investigation, America's submarines finally had a weapon worthy of their bravery. Early 1944, Midway Atoll. The war in the Pacific was shifting. For the first time, American submarines were not the ones struggling to survive. They were the hunters. From the icy waters near Japan to the burning coasts of the Philippines, the sound of torpedoes striking steel echoed through the Pacific night. The Mark 14 torpedo, once cursed, now carried the Navy's vengeance. And at the center of it all stood one man, Charles Lockwood, the admiral who had refused to surrender to silence. Lockwood's office aboard his flagship was filled with patrol reports. Each one told a story, not of failure this time, but of triumph. One report from USS Tang described how a single submarine had destroyed 6 ships in one night. Another from USS Harder praised the reliability of the new firing pins. Every torpedo hit hard, every explosion clean. Lockwood smiled faintly as he read. The Pacific was finally turning blue again, and the men who once doubted their weapons were now feared by the Japanese Navy. But behind every report, he saw ghosts, the hundreds of submariners who had died before the fixes, their missions lost to broken weapons and broken promises. He never forgot them. Back in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance finally began its own review. What they found was embarrassing. A chain of mistakes hidden by pride and fear of accountability. Documents revealed that engineers had known about potential flaws years before the war began, but testing had been postponed again and again to save costs. When Lockwood read that report, he didn't celebrate. He just muttered one sentence under his breath. They were saving dollars and spending lives. By mid-1944, the Pacific submarine fleet had transformed into a force of devastation. Silent killers beneath the waves, they cut Japan's supply lines to pieces. In just 12 months, American submarines had sunk over 5 million tons of enemy shipping. Entire convoys vanished beneath the sea before ever reaching their destinations. Fuel, food, ammunition, everything Japan needed to survive, was running out. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now bleeding in silence. Undone not by bombs from above, but by torpedoes gliding unseen below. And none of it would have been possible without Lockwood's defiance. In his private diary, Lockwood wrote, "I have lost good men because we believed too much in our machines. But I have learned that courage is not just facing the enemy. It's facing the truth when no one else will." He knew he had made enemies in Washington. He knew that his name would never be celebrated like the famous admirals of fleet battles. But he also knew that every ship sunk, every crew that came home alive, was proof that he had done the right thing. By late 1944, the USS Holland continued producing Johnson's modified exploders, and Lockwood's orders spread across the Pacific. Even admirals who once dismissed him now followed his directives. Submarine captains began writing him personal letters, thanking him for giving them their weapons back and their confidence. One message from USS Barb simply read, "Sir, your torpedoes finally hit like hammers. Thank you." Another from USS Drum said, "For the first time we feel we're fighting with our own strength, not luck." Lockwood kept every letter. He said they meant more to him than any medal. But even with success flooding in, the Admiral's war was far from over. There were still bureaucrats who tried to downplay his role, still voices in Washington who claimed the torpedo issues were exaggerated. To them, Lockwood didn't argue. He simply pointed to the results. Before his reforms, 80% failure rate. After his reforms, 90% success rate. No speech could argue with that. In 1945, as the Pacific War neared its brutal end, Lockwood stood aboard a submarine returning from patrol. The crew invited him to join them on the bridge as they approached Pearl Harbor. The ocean shimmered with sunlight, and in the distance the harbor cranes rose like quiet sentinels. For the first time in years, Lockwood felt peace. One young officer beside him asked softly, "Sir, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't tested those torpedoes?" Lockwood looked out over the calm sea, his expression unreadable. After a moment he said, "Yes, and that's why I never stopped." August 1945, the war ends. The Pacific, once filled with fire and fury, was quiet again. The empire of Japan had fallen, and the men who fought beneath the waves were finally coming home. At Pearl Harbor, submarines returned one by one, their hulls scarred, their flags tattered, their decks crowded with weary sailors. They had fought in silence, unseen by the world, but their impact had been devastating. In just a few short years, American submarines, barely 2% of the Navy's total force, had destroyed more than half of Japan's merchant fleet. And among the sailors walking down those piers was Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, the man who had changed everything. He wasn't there to give speeches. He wasn't there to celebrate. He simply stood at the dock, shaking the hands of each returning commander one after another. Some saluted him. Some hugged him. Most just looked at him with quiet gratitude, because they knew they were alive because of him. Lockwood's fight had never been about glory. It had been about truth. In the end, the Mark 14 torpedo, once called the Navy's shame, became the weapon that helped win the Pacific War. But victory came at a price far greater than money or metal. It came at the cost of the brave men who went to battle with broken weapons, who trusted a system that had failed them, and who never returned. Lockwood carried that weight for the rest of his life. After the war, he returned to the United States, his name known across the fleet but rarely spoken in Washington's halls. He had embarrassed too many powerful people to ever be fully celebrated, but among the submariners, the men of steel and salt, he was a legend. They called him Uncle Charlie. He visited the docks often, even after retirement. He'd walk among the crews talking quietly, asking about their families, their next missions, their hopes. He never talked about himself. To the young sailors, he wasn't just an admiral. He was proof that courage didn't always wear medals. Years later, during an interview, a journalist asked him, "Admiral, how did you find the strength to defy orders when everyone above you said you were wrong?" Lockwood smiled faintly. "Because," he said, "I had to choose between obeying orders and saving lives. And I chose the lives. It wasn't arrogance, and it was duty in its purest form." By the 1950s, the Navy had completely overhauled its torpedo testing program. Every new weapon was now live tested in real conditions before approval, a direct result of Lockwood's defiance. Engineers called it the Lockwood Standard. A rule born not from textbooks or theories, but from the blood and lessons of men who refused to accept failure. As the years passed, Lockwood lived quietly in California. He wrote books about submarines and the men who fought in them, but never about his own battles with the Bureau. He never needed credit. The success of his crews was reward enough. Sometimes when he walked by the ocean, he'd stop and stare at the horizon. The waves rolled softly, calm and endless. No sound of depth charges. No echo of explosions, only peace. And yet in his mind, he could still hear the hum of a torpedo firing from its tube, the rush of water, the distant rumble of an explosion far below the surface. Those sounds were the soundtrack of his life, the echoes of a war fought not just against an enemy, but against failure itself. One of his officers once said, "Lockwood didn't just fix a weapon, he restored our faith." And that might be the greatest victory of all. When he passed away years later, the Navy honored him quietly, as he would have wanted. No parades, no headlines, just submariners standing in silence, saluting the man who had fought for their right to fight back. In the stillness of that ceremony, the ocean seemed to whisper, as if even the sea remembered the Admiral who had challenged its depths and his own. Navy alike. Charles A. Lockwood's legacy lives wherever men and women refuse to accept good enough, where truth outweighs politics, where leadership means standing alone if it must, because courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to look away when the truth is right in front of you. And sometimes, one honest man can change the course of a war. The Pacific War ended long ago. The ships have rusted, the sailors have aged, and the oceans that once thundered with torpedoes now rest in silence. But somewhere beneath those calm waters lie the ghosts of a generation, the men who trusted their machines, fought against the odds, and never stopped believing that truth was worth the risk. Admiral Charles Lockwood proved something far greater than technical skill or military strategy. He proved that real leadership isn't about rank, it's about responsibility. When everyone else blamed the men, he defended them. When the system said obey, he said investigate. And when failure was hidden behind pride, he tore it open with evidence and courage. The story of America's broken torpedoes isn't just about engineering. It's about how arrogance nearly cost a nation its war, and how one man's persistence turned disaster into victory. The Mark 14 torpedo became reliable not because the Navy improved it, but because Lockwood refused to stop asking why. He fought lies with proof. He fought bureaucracy with action. And he fought for every sailor who had gone to sea with a weapon that didn't keep its promise. History remembers admirals who won battles, but Lockwood won something greater: trust. He restored faith in those who had lost it. He taught his fleet that sometimes the enemy isn't across the ocean. Sometimes it's right inside your own walls. And the next time the Navy tested a new weapon, someone always asked, "Have we Lockwood tested it yet?" That question became a legacy, a quiet reminder that courage isn't about following orders. It's about standing for truth when it's dangerous to do so. Today, when submarines glide silently beneath the waves, they do so armed with weapons that actually work, weapons tested in real battles, built on lessons learned in pain. And in every hum of an engine, in every torpedo launch, there's a trace of the man who made sure no sailor would ever be betrayed by his weapon again. Because Charles Lockwood's war was never just about torpedoes. It was about honor, the kind that can't be awarded, only earned. The ocean keeps its secrets, but history remembers the man who refused to accept them.